Well, hello and welcome to the first of a new series of talks on topical issues, hosted by the Resource Use Institute, or for short, RUI. It's a very small group that was founded in 1969 in Pitlochry, with the aim of bringing together people to discuss ideas for improving the world about them. And certainly as we wait this spring for the national budgets and the local council tax bills, something with the potential for making a real difference, for better or for worse, is the whole system of taxation. Plenty of people at all levels criticise the many anomalies in the various types of taxes we pay and the unfairnesses and the scope for some people to dodge it while other people get an ever-increasing burden. But no one seems to have any proposal for an alternative format. Well, no one till now, because our speaker is going to put forward an alternative form of taxation that he says would replace the main forms of current taxation, with enough left over to provide a universal basic income. The new concept is called annual ground rent and involves land. And Graeme McCormick is well placed to look in considerable detail at the subject, as he has over 40, in fact, close to 50 years experience in land and property conveyancing. He's been a solicitor all his working life since his graduation in law from Edinburgh University in 1975. In 1997, he established the largest dedicated conveyancing practice in Scotland, and he reckons that he's examined more title deeds than any other solicitor in the country. Now retired and living in Arden by Loch Lomond with his wife Suzanne, he continues to make the case for a fundamental rethinking of the whole taxation system. And he's here with us now to explain how a real reform might be possible. After his presentation, he'll be able to take questions, which you can start to send in any time from now on in text form through the chat system here, or you can put direct to him in person afterwards. So, Graeme, welcome. I'm looking forward very much to hearing about a fresh approach to a fairer taxation system.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Howie, and I'll just put down my my volume a wee bit so that I'm not getting the feedback. Okay, can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excuse me. Well, thank you very much, and also for allowing me to speak to you. I'm coming from a background of having been a Scottish nationalist since the early 1970s, and I was heavily involved in the referendum campaign. And after it, I wanted to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Scotland could fund all its public services and more without any subsidy from the UK government or elsewhere. So that really took me on a journey, and because of my interest and my involvement in property law, I looked at the idea of some sort of model of annual ground rent, which is not a new concept. Henry George was involved in promoting that in the 19th century, and the Scottish Land Review Group have been heavily involved in examining that over a piece. But I parted company with them in very good terms, I may say, because I didn't believe that an annual ground rent based on the value, the unimproved value of land, was the way to go. So I produced this alternative. I didn't know what I would find when I set off on this journey, but was amazed at the potential for the use of land and property as a source of public revenue. So I'll bring up the slides. They're quite intense, and I know that Howie is going to, I think, put this on YouTube after it. So if you don't quite get to digest everything in each of the slides, then there will be time to look at it at your leisure. So I'll bring this up now, Howie. Okay. Okay. Right, is that okay? Do you see that? Yeah, okay. Right, so I'm calling it Scotland Towards a Wellbeing Society. And that's what we're aiming for. And the purpose is to raise substantially more public funds, to eradicate poverty, but also to create an enterprising economy in which all have a personal financial stake. Scotland's land, excluding the seabed, is about 78 billion square metres. But to allow for the fact that most of urban Scotland, which I'll define shortly, comprises properties over 1 floor in height, we multiply that area defined as urban by a factor of 2. So for the purposes of what I'm calling AGFR, which I will explain in a minute, our land area is nearly 85 billion square metres. Scotland's total annual public expenditure, according to GERS, as recently as 22-23, which includes all the money spent on behalf of Scotland or in Scotland by the UK, Scottish and local governments and agencies, is nearly £107 billion. But we need more. So in order to reverse the austerity agenda and substantially provide more public funds to transform our infrastructure and pay for a worthwhile citizens' income, I have rejigged the figures so that the public expenditure shown by, according to GERS for the Scottish Government and local government, I've added 10% to that. I've left the figure, which is the guesstimate or estimate for the amount that the UK government estimates that it contributes. And then I've added the cost of a universal citizens' income of £10,000 for every resident in Scotland, and that would add another 55 billion. So the total is increased to nearly 168 billion pounds. So how do we raise all our public funding from our land? Well, we replace all existing UK, Scottish and local taxation with a model of annual ground rent charged per square metre in all publicly and privately owned land, and the roofs and floor space levied according to certain agreed land types. Now, the figures I'm going to give you here are based on an independent Scotland, but towards the end of the presentation, I'll also show how this can be operated under devolution too. So even if some of you are not convinced of the merits of independence, there is something in it for you as well. Okay. Now, you'll notice I've said all publicly and privately owned land, and that's important because it doesn't matter whether you're an owner, a public sector owner or a private sector owner, all land must be included in this. So I've called it AGFR, which stands for Annual Ground Floor and Roof Rent. And for simplicity's sake, I have 2 land types, but these could be increased or varied. You could have 10 land types, 20 land types, 50 land types. That would be for policyholders and government and parliament to decide how to extend this or change it or vary it in a certain way. So the 2 land types I have is rural and urban. And the rural area covers nearly 84% of the total area. And urban, which is defined as all non-agricultural buildings and also all buildings and land serviced by the public sewerage system. So basically all land within cities, towns, villages, etc., where there is a public sewerage connection. And that, because we're basically defining the urban area by a factor of, multiplying it by a factor of 2, it comes in at 16, just over 16% of the total. So the suggested rates per square metre for rural, it's 0.018 pounds per square metre, and in urban it's a whopping 12.13 pounds per square metre. Now, how you calculate your AGFR? You measure the footprint of each floor of your building, you add the area of your roof base, excluding any pitch, you add the area of your garden or land, you add the area of any pavement or publicly owned verge, you add half the area of the roadway, multiply the total by the applicable rates, make your return online to Revenue Scotland, and you pay in full or say over 10 months. And this is just a wee illustration of the different component parts of a kind of detached house on that basis. And the reason that we've included roads and pavements is historically in title deeds in Scotland, certainly in urban Scotland, the frontager owned the ground of the public footpath and half the road. Albeit that under the Roads Acts, the local authority or whatever would take over responsibility for these roads. But that's on the basis that if these roads were ever ceased to be public, that land and the right to maintain it, etc., and use it would revert to the frontager. So that's just the historical context for that. So there are some variations, obviously, to standalone properties. In rural settings, only non-agricultural buildings would attract the urban rate. In urban settings, the combined property and garden would attract the urban rate. Liability for common property in tenements, if there was 6 flats roughly the same size in a tenement, basically it would be a sixth of the total would be involved, including the back court, front entrance, close, all these bits and pieces. Landowners of urban type property would be entitled to recover the AGFR from their tenants, and landowners of agricultural land would be entitled to recover half the AGFR levied on the land. Now, the reason why the responsibility for payment of AGFR is basically the responsibility of the owner. But if we didn't have a system whereby an owner could recover in an urban setting all the AGFR from their tenant, then that would mean if somebody was a tenant either by choice or necessity, they wouldn't be contributing anything at all to public funds. So that's the reason why owners would be entitled to recover the AGFR in an urban tenancy. In an agricultural tenancy, they're only having to, the landowner would only recover half that, just to make it a bit easier for tenants of agricultural tenants to make ends meet. So why would you make your AGFR return? Well, there'd be spot checks and returns by Revenue Scotland with hefty penalties for inaccurate or dishonest returns and failure to make a return on time. The register would be public, so everyone's return would be transparent and largely self-policing, and whistleblowing would not be discouraged. There would be no tax evasion or avoidance and 100% collection, because there would be a charge registered against all titles at the start of each year, which would prevent their sale or mortgage until the AGFR is paid. And if it remained unpaid for, say, a year, the property could be repossessed by Revenue Scotland and sold to recover the outstanding AGFR with interest and legal costs, and any balance would be paid to the former owner. So to give you some examples of your total annual household or business AGFR in public funds and your contribution to public funds, a 3-bed modern semi-detached, the total would be about 4,500 odds. A small flat would be only £1,100. A single fronted shop, 854. An owner-occupied arable farm of 400 acres, which is, you know, a big farm, with farmhouse and agricultural buildings would be about £54,000 a year. A tenant of a rough grazing farm of, say, 100 acres, with a farmhouse and agricultural buildings would be £5,000 a year. Rough grazing and woodland of 221,000 acres, and a 5% total of that with non-agricultural buildings. And I illustrate that because that is basically to kind of illustrate what Mr. Anders Poulsen would be paying if this system came into operation. As some of you, or most of you probably know, he already has to pay to his local authority in Esbjerg, I think it is, in Denmark, for the wealth and the land which he owns in Scotland, which runs to several £1,000,000, I understand. Whereas for most of the land he owns in Scotland, he doesn't pay anything to Highland Council. But the figure he would pay under AGFR would be 71 million each year. And that would also apply to all the other large landowners, obviously. Okay, so just to give you this kind of illustration, a person on average annual earnings of £36,560 a year currently pays, and these are estimates that I've received from various sources, income tax, national insurance, VAT, and other consumer taxes, about £12,000 a year. Council tax and water charges have estimated, obviously it depends on the house they've got, about 2,000. So that's about total tax take of just over £14,000. Less the AGFR on an average house of £4,585. So actually you would save over £9,400 in that sort of scenario if AGFR replaced all other taxes. Now, this is just to give you some illustrations of properties. Balmoral Castle currently pays Band H annual council tax, and that's less than £3,600 a year. Obviously, tax to be paid our rates or excuse me, council tax on some of the other buildings on the estate, and they don't normally pay very much by way of rates for any of their land unless for stocking, etc. But anyway, the AGFR on that I've calculated just on the castle itself would be £170,000 a year. We have 180 hectares in Easter House in Glasgow. The houses were demolished many, many years ago. They didn't put up any, but they left the street lights up, as you can see. They grassed the areas. And the site with no development, the AGFR on that would be nearly £22 million. And if it had two-storey properties on it, the AGFR would be over £65 million. So here's a piece of land that's been in the public ownership for a long, long time. That basically has contributed really nothing towards the environment or to people having more houses and living in basically a pleasant area which could be put to far better use. Jordan Hill School, I think it's the only state school in Scotland or state-supported school in Scotland which isn't operated by a local authority for some reason. It's got a primary department, a senior school. It's also got playing fields. And I've calculated that roughly the AGFR on that would be £740,000. Now that seems a lot of money, but if you compare it against employers' national insurance contributions and other taxes, it works out 6 of one, basically half a dozen of the other. The former Co-op headquarters in Morris Street in Glasgow was abandoned years ago, and there was proposals to convert it into a hotel, but all of a sudden it was torched, and it's now just a gaping hole. It's contributed nothing to the city at all over all these years. But I've worked out that the AGFR would be something in the region of about £250,000 if the old buildings were still standing, or indeed if something new was put up. But basically, it's just sitting there as a kind of ugly gaping hole in the entrance to the city centre. We have the Queensferry Crossing. It's nearly £1 million would be the AGFR on that. In Helensburgh, I live near Helensburgh, and it was developed in the late 18th, early 20th century, 18th, early 19th century on a grid pattern, very attractive. But all the houses have lovely verges around them, but these verges don't belong to the house owners. They belong to Luss Estates, which is the Cahoon family's estate. And despite the fact that the Cahoons never cut the grass, it's left to the owners to do that. They don't maintain the cherry trees, etc. But if one of these house owners wants to create a new access into their garden from the road, they have got to pay for a servitude right from Luss Estates £10,000, £15,000, £20,000 just for the permission. So this is basically a case where a big landowner owns this, has huge influence, can make money out of it, but actually doesn't look on it as a liability at all. Under my proposal, I've estimated that Luss Estates would be paying AGFR of over £2 million a year on the land, these verges that they own in Helensburgh. Rothy Marcus, near where some of you live, the land alone, the AGFR I've calculated is about £2.5 million. Murrayfield, again, this was a kind of measurement I took. It would be nearly £3.5 million a year. BA Systems in Glasgow, the 2 yards Scotstoun and Govan, the AGFR that they would pay is £16 million. They're currently actually building this massive new shed so that they can build their warships undercover completely, and that will encourage, I'm told, that the Polish tradesmen to come over and work in the winter time, because they're refusing to do so just now because they don't like building out in the cold and the damp. Then Argyll Rig in St Andrews, a small development of flats. It's about £2,000. Sand End, this used to be our holiday home until a few years ago, £2,500. A semi-detached in Balfron, just over £5,000. In Balmaha, Balmaha Road, Drimmen, a lower flat, quite a big flat, it's just over the £4,000 mark. The old rope works in Port Glasgow, which basically remained empty and derelict for a long time, have more recently been converted into luxury flats. That building, the whole site, the AGFA is £276,000, and that would be the AGFA paid on it, payable on it, whether it was occupied or not. So it basically means for that period where it lay empty and was basically contributing nothing to public funds, that's the sort of money that would be available, and it would force the owner actually to do something with it, rather than just sit on it for you know, probably 20, 30 years. This is a property, it's a plot in Peebles. The plot, the AGFA on that is just over 5,000. The completed house is about 8,000. This property in Great Western Road, opposite the Gartnavel Hospital, has been like that for donkey's years. The AGFA on that is £20,000. And that would be payable by the owner, regardless of whether the house was left in that state or renovated. So again, it would discourage people from leaving properties like that. There would be a price to pay leaving a property in that condition and not actually bring it into use. This is my current home at Loch Lomond, and calculated that we would pay £8,200 the AGFA on that. And then Madeira Street in Greenock, a big Edwardian house in the West End of Greenock, about 30,000. The Kelburn Golf Club in Largs in the course, about 45,000. And that's basically because the ground is not connected to public sewer, but the golf club house is. And then we've got March Street Mills in Peebles, huge area which has now been converted into or developed into housing, I think, £500,000. Nardini's in Largs, £58,000 because it's just 1 story high. And finally, the townhouse and gardens in Kirkcaldy, I reckon the AGFA would be about £176,000. So the consequences for you are no tax on income and endeavour, purchased goods or services, inheritance or capital or council tax, no business tax or non-domestic rates. The market value of your home or premises would not be adversely affected. You would know exactly at the start of every financial year how much you were contributing to public funds, which nobody knows just now. You'd all get a citizen's income of £200 a week. Pensioners would also receive that in addition to their state pension. And I've suggested that 10% of everyone's weekly citizens' income should be invested in Scottish businesses through a Scottish investment bank, so everyone would have a personal interest in our economy. And there'd be no need for tax advisors, so if any of you are chartered accountants, I'm very sorry. Right, so the consequences for the big landowners, initially they wouldn't be able to sleep at night probably, but I have spoken to some of them. There will be a rush to offload, sale, rent or give away uneconomic land or buildings, thus initially reducing the market value, market price of land substantially. They won't keep land which doesn't provide sufficient income to pay AGFA. They will benefit, however, from their other assets not subject to inheritance or wealth or capital taxes. And it will be in their interest to develop, diversify and farm the land which they retain. And the other thing is that they won't claim ownership of land which is unproductive, which they presently do due to unspecific title boundaries. So this will overcome a major impediment to the completion of the land register. The consequences for local authorities: increase their budgets and devolution of powers. They could actually levy their own AGFA for council services and therefore reduce the charge which the Scottish Government would make accordingly. It would save them employers' insurance contributions and other tax liabilities. But they must manage or dispose of their land and property portfolios to meet AGFA charges. Now, the Land Commission's estimated that 60% of dilapidated and vacant land in urban Scotland is owned by the public sector. It's a huge area, and that is not contributing one iota towards public funds. So it's the responsibility of all, whether in the public sector or the private sector, to manage what they own so that there is a return on it in some shape or form. It would help the housing shortage by releasing surplus land. It would reduce bureaucracy quite considerably. And there would be a major reduction in empty properties and derelict sites. And it would improve the look of our townscapes. I think there's every town probably in Scotland, every street just about, has unsightly vacant sites or buildings which are dilapidated or only partly used. Maybe the ground floor is used, but the upper floors have just been left. So the consequences for Scotland: there'd be certainty of source and amount of public revenue every month. There'd be substantially more public and private funds to invest in our future. This doesn't include the wealth from our seas, which could be invested in a sovereign fund. That's entirely separate. We become a true property owning and sharing democracy. Encourages businesses to set up and invest in Scotland. Our public finances can actually always be in credit, given the amount of money that we can raise for this. It reduces the bureaucracy of government because we don't have a complex taxation system. Then it ends the black market. So basically, consumers are in a far better position against somebody that maybe is just now they might use to give a homer, but they get no, they get no guarantees that the work will be good or whatever. But so it ends that sort of aspect of it. And with the introduction of the citizens' income, it vanquishes poverty and a substantial reduction in the administration of the social security services too, as a result of this. This is just to show that AGFR can be introduced under devolution in Scottish Parliament, and the section is 80I. It's not 801, but it's 80I, 80I of the Scotland Act 1998, as amended. And the words, I've just put this up, I'll not spend much time on it, but I've just sort of highlighted 3 words: transactions, interests, and acquisition. Now, transactions, tax on transactions, these words are not defined in the Act, so therefore their interpretation is according to Scots law. And transaction is a very wide definition in Scots law. Transaction is not just buying something between 2 parties. A transaction can be a unilateral transaction. So, for example, under statute, making a will is a transaction. Serving a notice by a local authority or other government department or a factor is a transaction. All these things are transactions. So that if this was to be brought in, then the Revenue Scotland serving a notice to register and to pay is basically a transaction. Interest, now, it involves a transaction involving interest in land. Interest in land is not just acquiring the land by purchase or by through maybe being left in a legacy or something like that. It also, an interest is not just owning it, it's having an interest in it. So, for example, a mortgage lender has an interest in land. They don't own it, but they have an interest in land. Local authority could have an interest in land if they serve a dangerous building order or something of that nature, or maybe somebody goes into a home and the council puts a notice on the property so that the assets of the realisation of the value of the property is used in order to defray the cost of paying the elderly person's stay in the residential home or whatever. These are just examples of it. So the other thing that are interests in land are, for example, where somebody has a right of access over land in order to get to their own property, and that is an interest in land as well. So it's pretty extensive, this clause. So AGFR under devolution is paid, oops, wait a minute, it's paid directly to Revenue Scotland, so there is no need for any involvement of HMRC. It's paid direct to Revenue Scotland, which is the tax revenue department of the Scottish Government. What would happen under devolution is that Scottish personal and business taxpayers would pay their UK taxes to HMRC and Revenue Scotland would collect the AGFR sufficient to cover Scottish Governments and Council programmes. No grant would be paid by the UK Government to Scotland, by a block grant or consequentials for that matter. So the effect would be to expose the deficiencies in GERS, guesstimates, by Scotland being a net contributor to UK taxation. It would also give councils the opportunity, say, to charge their own land types and rates if that was decided by Parliament, and it could designate all the Scottish Government responsibilities as local under the Schedule to Scotland Act 1998. It would also have the opportunity to consider exempting or relieving certain land holdings, for example, charities or public land. My own view is that that shouldn't just be a carte blanche. There should be a real justification as to why something should be exempt, because the public sector are not known in certain cases for looking after what they own either. And that's important to bear that in mind. And Section 28 of the Scotland Act permits universal citizen's income provided Scotland covers the cost itself. So a universal citizen's income, as I say, can be provided by the Scottish Parliament under devolution, Section 28. They have that power provided that, one, they are not a pension related to age. They don't replicate existing reserve benefits. They're not funded in part by the UK Government Consolidated Fund, the National Insurance Fund and the Social Fund. So provided that provided all the funds citizens' income, then that power is satisfied within Section 28 of the Scotland Act. Now, how Scotland can become a true property owning democracy and entrepreneur dynamo. As I've said, 10% of the citizens' income would be used in order to invest in Scottish enterprise. Citizens could cash in their bond every year, but they'd have to leave at least 1 year's investment in the menu. And that would create a minimum every year of £5.5 billion of Scottish money to invest every year. And when we put that in context, I think the Scottish Government is proposing that £500 million be invested in the Scottish Investment Bank over the first 10 years of its existence. So it's a huge increase on the money that would be being invested in the Scottish economy rather than from inward investment. And everyone would then have a stake in the country's economy, everyone, absolutely everybody. And how these are other ones, Scottish entrepreneurs would have a constant source of loan funding. Young people would be able to build up substantial capital to help them. The menu of funds can be invested both nationally and locally in projects. So it's not all something that would be decided in Edinburgh or Glasgow. And it frees the creatives and entrepreneurs to develop their skills and businesses and trade globally and locally. Now, the source of all this of substantially increased public revenue is here. There's huge areas of privately owned derelict and empty land and floor space in urban Scotland. There's huge areas of publicly owned land and floor space estimated at over 9 billion, not contributing to national revenue. Apart from the buildings, most of all rural and urban land contributes virtually nothing directly to the national revenue. There are areas owned by charities contributing nothing to the national revenue. And there are significant areas of public open space with no thought as to their ongoing stewardship and value as a public asset funding source. So how does AGFR address the challenge of globotics? And globotics is basically the effect of robots and AI on the global economy. And that is something that we've got to be very aware of as we move forward. First of all, it gives everyone enough to live a guaranteed financially independent life, even if globotics and the spread of technology replaces most human jobs. It gives them the ability to, acquire or lease a small area of rural land that they can use for whatever purpose they want. As the public funding is obtained at AGFR through the land, changes to variables such as tax and income or consumption, significant changes in employment, that will not actually affect the amount of AGFR which is received by government, because it's based purely on the land and not how the other elements of an economy might be doing. Also, Over the next 50 years, occupations sheltered most from globotics are going to be the creative, intellectual and social ones. So that gives the people, the UCI gives the people the financial ability and time to develop knowledge and expertise through higher and further education. We can significantly reduce the working week, but maintain salaries and introduce these UCI, and it allows people to enjoy a better life-work balance, etc., towards the well-being agenda. So the options under independence are funding all public services through AGFIR. It does not rely on the volatility of oil revenues, but still has them to create, if we wish, a national sovereign fund. Increases the public revenue. It can still impose behavioural taxes or minimum pricing, possibly to target for specific purposes. It avoids government borrowing, so we've got the opportunity for a strong currency unaffected by speculators. And has control over our economy and encourages spending within Scotland. And it can be introduced very quickly. Revenue Scotland already exists, collects some taxes and integrates with the land register. The software for online registration already exists. It's just a matter of basically increasing the capacity. There's online facility to measure the extent of properties already. There's no need for cooperation UK Government or HMRC, as all payments go direct to Revenue Scotland. The land register has a cadastral plan of Scotland, so properties are easily identifiable. And basically what would happen is there'd be a cadastral plan for the AGFIR register, and as people registered their properties, that would get coloured in. So basically at the end of, say, a year, what was not coloured in, the Scottish Government would then be in a position where under the legislation it could repossess that land for for alternative uses. It's very simple. I mean, it's much simpler than the tax system we have, obviously. And there's no need to complete the land register, because basically the obligation to register for this AGFIR is on the owner. So if the owner doesn't register for it, then within the year or whatever time it's going to be, then the Scottish Government knows through the cadastral plan what bits have not been registered, so it would have the legal authority to repossess these sites. So that's people, owners that live offshore or trusts or anything like that, it doesn't matter where they are or where they're based. If they don't register for the AGFIR and pay it, then they will lose their property. Oops. Oh, sorry, there you go. Right. 2 or 3 last slides. The devolution or independence, this just basically shows the illustration of somebody on average earnings with a typical type of house, and what their net income would be. With devolution without AGFIR, it's nearly 22,500. Devolution with AGFIR, it's nearly 36,000. And with independence with AGFIR, it's nearly 42,000. Now, these figures might seem a bit fantastic, but actually, when you consider what the after-tax income of somebody, say, in Switzerland or Norway, it's not a kick in the pants of these kind of figures. So it shows it's possible. And these are just some quick illustrations which I've done. Again, something for you to look at leisure, showing you a single adult with a very modest job, part-time job, gets the universal system's income, lives in a small flat. Their net income would go up to nearly 13,500. I've shown a retired couple that currently maybe they're only getting 21,000 just now. Theirs would go up to about 38,000, etc., etc. That all depends on the different houses people have, but that's just to give a wee illustration of that. So the development, this is about the future development of AGFIR, because it could be developed further. For example, we could put a charge of AGFIR on energy distribution pipes and cables. We could do that just now, but we don't. We choose because these are heritable interests which the energy distribution companies have. And I've worked it out that it's £37 per metre would provide free energy to all Scottish consumers. The total energy bill in Scotland on the grid is roughly about £6 billion, and there's roughly about 3 million consumers. So that's roughly the figure that we're coming out with. We could charge Agfa on titles to mineral rights, because most title deeds in Scotland, the title to the mineral rights is separate from the title for folk that own their homes, etc. And then going forward, if we look at our exclusive economic area, there could be a charge on the seabed and items attached to that at some sort of future date too. So it has the capacity to expand quite significantly. So this is the last slide. What's all this about? It's basically about the stewardship of space, the space that we have, our land and what's on it. You've got to look at land as an asset and a liability. There's the opportunity, obviously, for rewilding. If big estates want to give up quite a lot of the land they've got, which they consider unproductive, then here's an opportunity to rewild massive areas of Scotland. It looks at the life balance involving the universal systems income, etc. And also it's to provide individual financial security. So that's the guts of it. So I'm happy to, thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed. There is lots and lots and lots of stimulating questions and ideas. And Graeme, can I just go back to the first point about the relationship of this to the existing council tax? The council tax is a kind of property tax, but one in which it's quite blurred, isn't it? Because you just get a number of bands and they're based on the local rent. It's a very complicated thing. So just in comparison to the council tax, you're saying by doing something that's precise and with ground space, roof, windows, and so on, you would be going, a scheme like this would be more precise, in other words, than the council tax. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes. I mean, council tax just now is based on value and on a valuation put on it by the valuers, and that's open to discussion as to whether that is the most effective way of doing it. There's a number of issues with council tax about when to revalue, etc. And should there be a revaluation after a property is renovated or extended, etc. Having worked in domestic conveyancing for so long, I think valuations generally are a bit of a con. I've seen how they're manipulated in the market and by lenders, by sellers, by purchasers, you name it. And I'm not a great fan of valuation. So basically, instead of being a system based on a ground value or an annual ground rent based on as a land value tax, this is just based on a unit and the unit in which the area of the unit you occupy. And regardless of whether your house is in Elgin or Aberdeen or Edinburgh or Glasgow or Paisley or whatever, there would be one rate per square metre. Now, it would be open for that to be changed, that you could have different rates in different parts of the country, depending on maybe, areas which are, considered less wealthy or more deprived than others. But for ease, I have just had one rate per square metre, depending on the land type involved, and that's how it's done. So it's very simple that way. As I say, it's very easy for somebody to calculate what the liability would be for the whole year.
Now, one of the big questions is winners and losers, and there might have been a sharp intake of breath among any small family farmer who was listening, because as we know, small family farms can be pretty marginal. And as things stand at the moment, this system would be putting a hefty payment, which they might well argue that they couldn't afford. What would be the solution to that?
Well, I mean, they do pay other taxes just now. I know that that is dependent on a lot of things. Some might not be paying anything in income tax, etc., but they'll be paying something for some of the things. They'll be paying for VAT and whatnot, and there might be others. So they wouldn't be paying these. But in addition to that, part of the package of this is the universal citizens' income of £10,000 a year each. So that is an income which they don't have just now. And it will be possible, not just in these circumstances, but it would be possible for in the first, say, 5 years of this being introduced, for there to be certain mitigations, so that there could be a ceiling on the liability that anyone would have to pay, any householder would have, or property holder would have to pay, so that they weren't paying any more than the, shall we say, the extra universal system income that they're receiving. You can do something like that, or you could defer payments until a certain period. I'm not in the business of trying to chase people out of their homes. But it's significant that if somebody is struggling to, because of the income that they've got, basically to maintain their homes, then this would be a wee bit of a wake-up call, because basically in law, you have not just the right of ownership, but you have the responsibility of ownership. And if you're not really, if you don't have the wherewithal to maintain your property, then, you know, you could, first of all, that I don't think that is fair to the wider community if they've got to, you know, if they're adversely affected by it. But it's also giving the nudge to the position that we have in Scotland, where over, I think, 33% of households are single households. And an awful lot of people are living in these households that are much bigger than what they need. But as I say, I'm not in the business of pushing people out of their homes. I think we do probably need a change of culture, which would develop over, say, 5 to 10 years, where people would be more receptive to the idea is once a house gets really too big for them, is it not time to kind of move on to something that is more appropriate or more comfortable than maybe what they're experiencing just now. So it would gradually, it would introduce a change of culture as to holding on to maybe a property for a longer time than it's this. I mean, I had that experience with my own mother. She wouldn't leave the big bungalow and garden that we had for years until basically it was too late. That's emotion for you, you know.
Tom's got a question.
Yes, Tom.
Yes, I should explain that I'm from a farming background in Orkney,
Right.
and I still have interest there, although it's less than 100 acres. I find this pretty scary, and I would support what Howie was just saying. You're going to basically empty the islands of farmers. There's no way they can pay these rates. You mentioned a figure of...
But even though they would get an additional £10,000 a year for every person in the household.
Well, I can't see how that's going to work, but I simply don't believe that this income has to come from somewhere. Let me take an example. You mentioned opportunities for rewilding. So I can't pay the rate that you levy. So you repossess it. The Scottish government repossesses my farm. You rewild it. You then have no income at all. Silch. And that's going to happen again and again and again. So unless you make an exception for the crofting counties, you're basically going to kill them off. And well, I believe that that is a realistic view, and I think your view is not realistic.
Well, my view is not realistic of everyone having a universal citizen income of £10,000 a year.
Well, it has to come from somewhere.
Well, I've shown you where it's coming from.
Yes, but
basically
the numbers that you...
Basically 98% of the AGFR actually comes from urban properties. It doesn't come from rural properties. So when I showed you at the top end, the rate per square metre for an urban property is £12.13 per square metre, as opposed to 0.012 pounds for rural properties. The vast bulk of the money, almost all the money, is coming from urban Scotland and not rural Scotland.
The only thing,
so though, you're in a position where you're asked to pay about £5,000 if you've got a a tenanted farm of 100 acres. But let's say there's 2 people in that farm. Well, they're immediately going to have an additional income of £20,000 coming into that household. You take off the 5,000 for the ag first, so they've got 15,000 better off. In addition to the other income which they will have, which will not have any tax attached to it at all. So, I mean, the figures I'm based on are not based on fanciful figures. They're based on figures that we know. We know what the size of Scotland is, the area that Scotland is, and we know what the government budget is. And it's basically a matter of dividing the government budget by the square meterage, and you get the rate per square meter, and then you make the adjustment for affordability on in the land types. And we've found that if the urban land types are paying about 98% of the total per square meter, then it's affordable for all of them, but it's also affordable for the folk who live rurally. So the money's there. I mean, these aren't estimates I'm giving. These are based on figures that are in the public domain.
Yes, sorry, Graeme, I was going to ask, could you show us those or tell us again those farm figures? I think this is the kind of key one. The two or three examples of an actual farm, and if we could see the figure.
Wait a minute, I'll need to bring it up. Hold on a second. Right, yeah. Zoom again. Right, share screen. Oh, bring it back up. Right, so I said, a minute. There you go. Right. There you go. So a tenancy rough maiden farm of 100 acres, it would be £5,000 a year. They would that would be the liability for the household.
The tough one there, you see that owner-occupied arable farm, 400 acres, 54,000. That's a huge amount. Now, from what you're saying, if it's two people in that house, you're getting universal basic income of 10,000 each, 20. But that's a huge gap for the farm to have to fill.
Well, you've got to remember that, I mean, I think most of the farms, there aren't an awful lot of farms of 400 acres in Scotland, but most of the ones, as far as I can see from looking at the NFU records, are pretty profitable. And they have fairly substantial grants paid to them. Now, I know these are revised, etc., because of Brexit, but you know, there's a lot of these are highly successful farms, but you know, there's a conversation to be had whether that figure is sustainable or not. But since 98% of the AGFR which is being collected nationwide comes from urban properties, really although individually the contribution that some people would be making in rural properties towards this would be quite significant. As part of the total, it's a pretty insignificant amount of money. It's only about 2%.
I know, but of course, for the person who owns that farm,
that's right. But that, you know, it's a conversation how to have, and it might well be that what would happen is that for agricultural land or rural land, we would have to have more land types, as a result of which we say the golden triangle of arable land in Scotland and Tayside and Fife, etc., would be charged at a higher rate than upland, moorland farm land and that kind of thing. You know, it's not a difficult thing to actually put in place. But I'm just showing these for kind of illustrative purposes. But I'm quite sure that a farm in northeast Fife of 400 acres could more than afford £54,000 a year, because they're I know for a fact that there are millionaires that own some of these farms.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between the types of land. Tom, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I was just wondering, have you consulted any real farmers about this?
Yes. In fact, I consulted one when I'm talking about the Golden Triangle. I've actually consulted a farmer that actually two in fact that operate in the Golden Triangle. One in Fife and one in Angus. And they didn't, although they don't want to pay anything. Fair to say, you know, they were not put out when they looked at what they are having to pay just now. There was quite a considerable saving for them on this. But as I say, this is something which could be changed and varied so that we have maybe 10 different rates land types in rural Scotland. You know, that could be considered quite easily. But I haven't gone into all the different you know, different land types that we could have, but obviously, you know, that's a possibility, and I think the Scottish Government has, you know, quite a substantial library of the different land types that there are, and the grading of land. I'm not a farmer myself, so it's not something I know an awful lot about. But you know, there's no problem about that. If that figure is, these figures are felt beyond people's ability to pay them, well, we can change them. There's no problem.
You see, as I see it, the fundamental problem here is that the taxation income that you get is going to be related to the amount of income generated by that area of land. And with the best will in the world, if that area of land, after the farmer has some income for himself, is only £20 an acre, then there's no way you can get more taxation out of that guy. He's going to go out of business.
Well, that's right. So that's why we probably need more land types, to increase the number of land types for the types of different rural property, and the ability to you know, to raise the funds on you know, the land that they've got. That's fair enough. I don't have a problem with that. But the system will still work. It just means that we charge at a different rate, so that there is an affordability in place. But that's not a problem with the principle of the system. What you've raised is an issue with the actual rate which is charged against the property. I mean, I looked at the payments and the grant payments which were received for quite a few of the bigger operations, and these grants were really quite considerable, far more than 54,000 in many places. And I'm not proposing that these grants cease. There would still be the capacity for providing these grants or another system if that's deemed necessary. But the principle is good. It's just that the affordability issue would need to be addressed. If there are people that you know, have 400 acres but we're not in a position to pay £54,000 a year in AGFA, if that was the case. But I do know farmers that could more than pay that. And for 400 acres in Scotland. Okay. Any other questions?
I had one, and I wanted to ask you a bit more about derelict land. You showed some interesting examples of derelict land. Now, suppose I own, say, an acre of derelict land in Edinburgh or Glasgow. How much would I pay now? And would that be an incentive to me to develop it or to sit on it? Or how would it, in other words, what would the effect be on me as compared to what the situation would be now if I own my acre of derelict land in a city?
If you've got an acre of derelict land in Edinburgh or Glasgow, then basically you're not paying anything for it just now. You don't pay anything for it just now.
Oh, I see.
You don't pay any rates on it if it's derelict in land, you see. Whereas under this system, it doesn't matter whether it's derelict or being occupied, you pay the same amount. So it's to encourage people that have derelict property or vacant land that's maybe a gap site, to do something with it so that they can raise enough money either to pay the ag for every year, or indeed, sell it on or pass it on to somebody else who will develop it so that they will get a return.
I see. So at the moment, I can sit on my land knowing that it'll probably appreciate in price, and I can sit tight. And in fact, if I do nothing with it, I'm open to all the options that may come in. But under the AGFIR system, there is a pressure on me. If I've got that valuable land, there's a pressure on me to do something with it. If I fail to do something with it, if I just sit on it, I'm going to pay that annual ground rent every year. Yeah,
that's right. And the other thing to consider just now is that we had an issue in Helensburgh where there were a lot of properties which weren't being particularly well maintained in our town centre. The council gave planning permission for a supermarket, out-of-town supermarket in the edge of the town. And a condition of the planning permission was that the supermarket contributed a fairly significant sum of money, which a fund which owners of properties in the town centre could get access to in order to do up their frontages and basically tidy up the fronts of their shops, etc. Now, that's all very well if it's somebody that's, basically got very little by way of spare cash to do something like that. But that fund was also available to shop owners such as the Edinburgh Woolen Mill. Could buy and sell all of us, several times over. And things like this. So I have a wee bit of a suspicion about people and companies that own property but don't maintain them. And they are eligible for grants. I mean, we even know with regards to, I think, the restoration of peatlands, that some of the Middle East rulers who have estates in Scotland are eligible to apply for grant aid from the Scottish Government to restore peatlands. That's an anathema to me. I think, if that really shouldn't be something which is being encouraged. And so that we've got to get over that there is a responsibility and a liability if you own property, to maintain it. And, you don't, you shouldn't win a watch because you don't maintain it, which is sometimes the case, just now, by the way, that grants are, are issued for certainly good purposes.
There's an opportunity to ask one or two more questions. I had a feeling that I thought David about to ask a question, but I could be wrong.
I think Peter has.
Oh, Peter, you've got a question. I'll unmute. You just need to unmute, Peter. That's it.
Yeah. As you said, Howie, that Graeme has presented a huge amount of information that he's obviously spent a lot of time, you know, composing and researching and so on. I suppose two things that strike me. One is that I don't know of a taxation system of any kind that doesn't have an upside, but also has a downside. And Graeme, I think, with respect, didn't point to any downside at all with this system. And I just wonder what his thoughts are on that. And the second thought I had as he was speaking was to think about how conservative the political institutions of this country have been over the last 100 years and more, last 150 years, about taxation changes. And I mean, I can think back, or I can't think back, but I know that in the early part of the 20th century, a land value tax was approved by Parliament, and all the preparations were made for that. Astonishing preparations, actually. And then it was never implemented for a variety of reasons. I can think of tax simplicity in the sense of the poll tax was supposed to be a simple tax. And of course, we all know what happened to that. And then the successor to the poll tax was simply a fudge to create council tax in a hurry. That tax system was never supposed to be maintained. It was supposed to be reviewed within a few years, and it's never been reviewed almost 35 years later. Even within the council tax system that Scotland's had responsibility for around 25 years, it's never been revalued, and it's kind of pretty hopeless representation of property markets in Scotland now. There have been debates in the Scottish Parliament going back 20 odd years about land value tax, but nobody's ever pursued it, despite the fact that there's been lots of debates about it. And there are many features of land value tax that are similar in intent, at least, to what Graeme is seeking. And I think some of the intent is entirely laudable, I have to say. But also, you know, we've never imposed non-domestic rates, or in recent times, on agricultural property. And why is that? And it comes to some of the reasons I think that Tom and you were touching on, Howie. And then there's you know, all the sort of tax benefits that there are. I mean, you don't pay capital gains tax on your forestry investments. You don't pay inheritance tax on some of these investments. And it is argued by the Treasury that these are required to encourage people to plant trees for national needs. We've only tinkered around with property taxes in Scotland in the sense of a wee premium on land and buildings transaction tax for the purchase of a second home. My point is that there is no evidence at all, I regret to say, that any radical tax proposals will see the light of day. And I just wonder how Graeme assesses the politics of all of this, and, you know, why it is that there is such conservatism in political thinking about all this, and why he thinks this proposal might have a better chance than any of the other proposals that have come and gone, roof taxes and all sorts of things have come and gone down the years. I'd be interested in his comments on those 2 points.
Hey, Peter, well, thank you very much. That's very interesting. It's a hard slog, as you probably have discovered yourself. It's a hard slog to get politicians to consider any form of taxation, because I think there is that kind of inbuilt fear that with taxation there will be someday, or there could be a considerable number of people, or it will be perceived a considerable number of people will be worse off. And politicians are generally very kind of tentative at putting a toe in the water for that, or sticking a toe in the water for that. I've done about 100 presentations around Scotland, mostly to SNPS groups on this for the last kind of 5 or 6 years. And they're all energised by it. But if there are politicians in the room, they're like Trappist monks. They won't say anything. They won't comment on them. I've given presentations to government ministers, and you know, they say they're quite interested in it, but actually trying to get them to engage further in that is a problem. So yeah, it's a problem of the hope that they might consider something along these lines. Excuse me. I also find within the economists community in Scotland that there is a reluctance to engage on the idea of whether it's a land value tax or a property tax, a different type of property tax to any material extent. Significantly, however, the IMF have done quite a wee bit of work on this. And I've been in correspondence and have had an exchange of correspondence with a guy called Professor Gregor Schwerhoff, who has written and researched quite extensively on it. And he came back to say that it is perfectly possible for a government's programme, not just in Scotland, but in other countries as well, to be paid for by land being the only source of public revenue. And he says it's possible. And he then directed me to the World Bank, which has actually done extensive work on the issue of poverty and the relationship of poverty and land ownership and land reform, not just in the developing countries, but in some of the developed countries too. And they are, from the writings in there and the research they've done, you know, they see a real potential benefit of that. Funnily enough, just a few weeks ago, I was down in Cambridge, and there was a public lecture by a guy called Professor Roderick, who is the professor of economics at Harvard. And his speech was on, his lecture was on a new paradigm for economics. And he took about an hour to go over the different types of economics theories which there have been. And in the last 5 minutes, he said that the new paradigm was good work. That's what it was, good work. And so I asked him a question along with others. I said, well, you've not mentioned land reform. And given that the IMF and the World Bank relate that to an eradication of poverty, and he came back and he was quite open about it and said, well, that's something I hadn't considered. But he said, when I think about it, that is how Singapore managed to develop the way that it's done, because they had land reform and they used land as a source of a significant amount of their public funding. So it has been done elsewhere. There's maybe about 120 different forms of land taxation. There are countries that have it around the world, as well as other forms of taxation, admittedly. So it really is something that, I harp on, because I'm an SNP member, I harp on about it constantly, as why the Scottish Government has not moved the dial on that significantly. I've been highly critical of this new land reform bill that's coming forth. I've been highly critical of the Land Commission too, because the report that they did on land value taxation did not take into consideration property taxes which were not based on land value, and up to now they've not been prepared to look at that and address it. So yeah, we have an establishment here, a political establishment, and probably an administrative establishment too, that is very reluctant to get involved in this. And but if we are looking to raise money and not plead poverty within Scotland, then we have the opportunity in the Scotland Act actually to do it. And I say, I just keep knocking the door in the hope that I'm going to start to open one or two of these doors of the decision makers and the policy makers, which will move things forward. And that's really basically it.
Peter, would you like to come back on that? Do you think indeed any form of taxation based on land is just too much of a hot potato? Or do you think, given in one way that council tax is linked to property in a fairly general way, do you think there is potential?
Well, I've always thought personally that there is something in land value tax, and what Graeme is talking about is a different way of looking at the same kind of issue, which is to try and create incentives for deconcentrating the ownership of land in Scotland, because we live in we're a complete isolate in an outlier, I should say, in world terms, land ownership, and there are very profound economic consequences from that, in the way that wealth is concentrated in very few hands, power is concentrated in very few hands, influence is concentrated in very few hands. The use of our land, decision making, is concentrated in very few hands, and that affects our snake environment, our biodiversity and so on and so forth. So I see some of the arguments. I think it's just interesting that virtually no country in the world has introduced land value tax, notwithstanding its merits. I mean, there'll be some, and Graeme has pointed to that, but very, very few of modern Western democracies, if you like, have done that. Now, that could be something to do with where power lies in our wider establishment. And but I mean, I guess the real point I wanted to make was I admire Graeme's grit and determination to keep his ideas.
One thing, thank you, Peter. One thing I will say is I've had conversations. I've given this presentation to two big landowners, big rural landowners in Scotland, and representatives of them. And once I'd picked them off the floor, and then they actually started to think about it logically. And they said, look, we've got huge tracts of land which we own. We do nothing with it. We hold on to it on the basis that maybe one day the Scottish government will come along and say, I want to build a road, or I'm going to need a bit of land for this or that, and they'll get some money out of it. But it isn't actually central to their business model. Their business model might be a couple of farms, they do in hospitality, hotels, all that kind of stuff, etc. So that they wouldn't necessarily, they would see the logic of being prepared, you know, to give up quite a bit of the land that they have just now, if it meant that they didn't have to pay a significant amount of ag for it. So I think that is something which should be tested. And the thing that I've been sort of trying to do, because I know that, you know, there will be legal challenges to a system like this. But if you're challenging a rate per square metre for a certain land type, so regardless of whether you own an acre in rural Scotland or, you know, 50,000 acres in rural Scotland, if you're being charged the same rate per square metre, then you know, you are treating everybody equitably within that land type. So I would think that there is a far greater prospect that any legal challenge to developing a system like this would be unlikely to be successful, as long as we treat everybody the same according to land type and charge it at the same rate. That's one of the.
I think, Howie, if I can come back in, that I think to this extent I would agree with Graeme that, you know, landowners will not give up any land unless there is a direct penalty for their lack of use of the land. The problem, not the problem, well, one of the challenges we've got right now is that huge amounts of what has hitherto been regarded as valueless land in Scotland, the type that Graeme is mentioning, suddenly has got colossal value because of the need to sequestrate carbon, and therefore peatlands, which were you know widely regarded as worthless for generation after generation, and no income was capable of being made from it, suddenly becomes a potentially huge asset. Yeah. And equally, the ability to plant trees is also now sought after. That's why people are flocking to Scotland from around the world. I slightly overstate that, but there's lots of people interested in investing in Scotland to use our environment to extract wealth for them. But also some of them are buying up land because we've got a completely unregulated land market, and therefore there are no controls on it. If you want to buy land in Scotland, the checkbook's big enough, you can buy whatever you like. And literally no questions are asked. So suddenly land is becoming more valuable to owners in a way, and indeed suddenly owners are looking to extract value out of croft land, because croft land contains a lot of peat, for example, particularly in the Western Seaboard and Western Isles, and in Shetland for that matter. And as a crofting friend of mine was saying to me today from Shetland, he said, we got rid of the landowners out of crofting in 1886. We shouldn't let them back in to claim our carbon credits. And so there are major policy challenges here. I mean, taxation is one way of beginning to intervene in that, but there are other much more simple things if there was a political will to do that. But anyway, that's a matter for another Knight how he passed.
Yep. No, I mean, I agree with these sentiments entirely, and that, I mean, I think that the issue of the carbon set-offs and all the rest of it, I mean, I just don't think that we should permit that. And that there's also the issue, you know, in Denmark, you know, you've got to live in Denmark for a few years before you can buy anything. And I think there is something to be said for us also to regulate that, because it's been an open door up to now, but that's not part of this sort of presentation. The other thing I will say is about tax. If you're tax in this country is in the UK generally is so complicated. I mean, there's about, what is it, 700 pages to the tax log or something like that. That the accountant I had before I retired, and I may say he didn't manage to swing this for me, but he said if you're very wealthy in this country, tax is largely voluntary. You can arrange your affairs in such a way that tax is largely voluntary. Now, the one thing about this proposal is you can't avoid it. So that I think in itself is a benefit. But and the other thing is that, you know, when governments of all hues and shades, etc., attempt in all good faith to close a loophole, another loophole opens up. It always opens up, because there are very clever people who are employed to do that and make a lot of money out of it. So there is something to be said for having a very simple system which basically cannot be avoided or evaded. And that was part of my thinking in developing this.
There's time for one or two questions before we round off. Just while we're waiting for a question for a moment, I'll mention an example about land use, and this happened in Orkney after the First World War, when death duties were introduced and the government obviously needed to raise money by tax. It meant that the big estates, which had their great heyday in the 19th century, but were tending to run down a bit, the big estates had to pay death duties. And in order to pay them, they sold off then the units of the various farms on the estate to the tenants. And that really is how Orkney today is owner-occupied. And of course, the tenants worked hard, being owner-occupiers, got all the benefits from their work, were eligible for agricultural support. And a lot of Orkney's prosperity today really came out of that. So it is interesting how taxation changes can really make a difference on land use. Time for two more questions. I'm sure David has one.
Yeah, Howie, can I jump in with a quick question? I have 3 or 4 small observations. The first one is that there's some very, very interesting ideas here. These are memes that are going out there into the world, and I noticed that Graeme talked about well-being at the beginning. You know, he was saying that, you know, this is a means to well-being. Well, there are lots of memes out there supporting well-being now, and we're seeing cultural change around that. So I think this is a great contribution to those, even if it might not work easily and difficult to implement and all those sorts of things. But the idea is what needs to get out there. The second thing is in Malcolm Slessor and Jane King's book, they talk about natural capital, and they mention environmental space as being an important issue. Well, that's what this is. This is all about environmental space. The sun shines on the land, the wind blows over the land, and who can take advantage of the wind and the waves and the whatnot? If it isn't, you've got to find a way of getting value back to the people for that. The third thing is, Graeme mentioned the pedestrian plan that supposedly exists. Well, to I know for a fact that the crofting register plan is hopeless. It is not up to date. It's miles. It's miles out of date. It's never been completed because they never had sufficient funds or people to do it, and so it's a magnitude issue to complete a cadastral plan of all of Scotland and keep it up to date requires quite a lot of investment and personnel, etc. So getting that to work properly, I think, might be a bit of a challenge. My last observation is to do with hypothecation. Whenever we raise money, people say, "Oh yeah, we'll raise money for healthcare. We'll raise money for care in the community." We're quite prepared to somehow or other pay more money for these things. So I think that the question of if we were going to raise money, we'd need to have some form of hypothecation or some way of telling people that if you do something like this, you're going to spend it on these benefits. And my question now, having said those as observations, my question to Graeme is: could we think of a stage one instead of jumping straight in? Could we start with a stage one is to a sort of back door into this idea? I think Peter was mentioning something about different work that's already been going on about land reform. Is there a back door into something like this? That's me. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I should possibly have said that when the land register was first introduced in Scotland, in I think it was 1981, I was a solicitor in Paisley, and Renfrewshire was the first operational county of the land register. And I remember an official from the land register telling us in 1981 that it would take 10 years to complete the land register. We're in 2024 now. We're lucky if probably about 65% of the land register has been completed, but we do have the general register of seasons, obviously, for the other areas. So there is a task there. The difference with this is that the obligation to register for AGFA, it would rest with the owner of the property. And if their property was already registered in the land register, then in most cases they could just refer to the ordnance survey map, which forms part of their title deed. In cases where their title hadn't been registered yet in the land register, there would be the facility in registering basically to use an ordnance survey map and to plot out on that, chart out on that what they believed that they owned. And the AGFA could be charged according to that. Now, yeah, the land register would need to, in itself, would need to upscale a bit in order to deal with the outstanding areas which have yet to be registered in the land register. But because they would have that information from the AGFA register, then they could use that plan in order to register in the land register the owner's title. And if the owner then said, "Oh, but I actually own more than I have actually admitted to in the AGFA register," then there would be a case, I think, of maybe a couple of cases of fraud, against the owners of the land. So it's a way by which we can facilitate the completion of the land register too. But there are ways that can be done. So that would be one comment. On the issue of basically, could this be brought in a kind of phased way? One way, the kind of figures that I worked out, it would be much more beneficial if it was brought in a winner. But it would be possible to bring it in as an alternative for council tax and non-domestic rates. And I've done some figures for the likes of Dundee and Glasgow, which are virtually all urban, where they could operate it and raise all the money that they need for their budgets and more without any direct grant from the Scottish Government. Now, the benefit of that to them is that they would then hopefully be able to be more independent in the way that they develop policy, and not be as much of a kind of agency of the Scottish Government. So I think from a democratic point of view, that would be a good thing for local democracy. So it would be possible for them to do that. What you would need to do, however, is consequently reduce the budget that the Scottish Government require. So maybe the Scottish Government would decide to set a zero rate for income tax and earned income, for example, and some other things, in order that they didn't need the same budget as they require just now, because of the among other things, the grant which they give local authorities in order to fund their activities. So that's a possibility that could certainly be discussed and explored. The other thing I should say, I mean, Derek Pretzel isn't with us tonight, and you'll all know Derek. I mean, Derek, in his, I think it's fair to say, in his assessment of the rewilding of Scotland, I think he looks on, we must have a huge area which becomes a kind of tapestry from the north to the south, where our indigenous species have got the space to regenerate, etc., without human intervention in many respects. And part and parcel of what I'm proposing is that if the big estates were prepared to release quite a lot of their land to the Scottish Government for a rewilding project on a grand scale like this, then this could assist that in a fairly significant way.
Really interesting. I think unless there's any more, we can round off, but anyone with any further comments or questions to round off? I know there's lots more, and we'll think about them afterwards and look forward to an opportunity to speak again. Can I just double check in case anyone has a final point? Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, to everyone joining in. Some really interesting questions and comments in the discussion. And Graeme, thank you very much indeed. You've given us something really interesting to chew on. And indeed, that the concept is fascinating. And then there are so many questions of detail. But indeed, given that the situation is changing with tax, and it looks like the situation is ongoing with land in Scotland, this is clearly a topic that is highly relevant. So big thank you again to everyone. Big thank you to Graeme. This is the first of a new series of talks by the Resource Use Institute, and we'll be back. I'll circulate details of the next one, which will be on Wednesday at the end of February. So in the meantime, thanks again to everyone, and thanks again, Graeme.
Yep. My pleasure. Nice to see you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.